Listen to them. Children of the night. What music they make.
The vampire. The very name conjures up terror. A vampire is a creature that exists by feeding on the blood of the living. In European folklore, vampires are undead creatures that often visit loved ones and cause mischief or death. Vampires have been recorded in most cultures. The term vampire was popularized in Western Europe after reports of an 18th century mass hysteria of a pre-existing folk belief in the Balkans and Eastern Europe that in some cases resulted in corpses being staked and people being accused of vampirism. In modern times, the vampire is generally held to be a fictitious entity, although belief in vampires, such as the chupacabra, still persist in some cultures. Folk belief in vampires has sometimes been ascribed to the ignorance of the body's process of decomposition after death, and how people in pre-industrial societies tried to rationalize this, creating the figure of the vampire to explain the mysteries of death. The charismatic and sophisticated vampire of modern fiction was born in 1819 with the publication of The Vampire by the English writer John Polidori. Bram Stoker's 1897 novel Dracula is remembered as the quintessential vampire novel and provided the basis for much of the modern vampire legend. The success of this book spawned a distinctive vampire genre, still popular in the 21st century, with books, films, television shows, and video games. The vampire is a dominant figure in the horror genre. Vampires have existed for millennia. Cultures such as the Mesopotamians, Hebrews, ancient Greeks, and Romans had tales of demons and spirits, which are considered precursors to today's vampire. Despite the occurrence of vampiric creatures in all these ancient civilizations, the folklore for the vampire originates from early 18th century southeastern Europe. Verbal traditions of many groups of the region were recorded and published. In most cases, vampires were revenants of evil beings, suicide victims, or witches. They could also be created by malevolent spirits possessing a corpse, or by being bitten by a vampire. Belief in such legends became so pervasive that in some areas it caused mass hysteria and even public executions of people believed to be vampires. In the folkloric tradition, vampires were usually reported as bloated in appearance and ruddy, purplish, or dark in color. These characteristics were often attributed to the recent drinking of blood. Blood was often seen seeping from the mouth and nose when one was seen in its shroud or coffin, and its left eye was often open. It would be clad in the linen shroud it was buried in, and its teeth, hair, and nails may have grown, although in general fangs were not a feature. Although vampires were generally described as undead, some folk tales spoke of them as living beings. In order to prevent the victim of a vampire from turning into an undead themselves, burying a corpse upside down was widespread, as was placing earthly objects such as scythes or sickles near the grave to satisfy any demons entering the body, or to appease the dead so that it would not wish to arise from its coffin. This method resembles the ancient Greek practice of placing an obelisk in the corpse's mouth to pay the toll to cross the river Styx to the underworld. Other methods commonly practiced in Europe included severing the tendons at the knees, or placing poppy seeds, millet, or sand on the ground at the gravesite of a presumed vampire. This was intended to keep the vampire occupied all night by counting the fallen grains. Corpses presumed to be vampires were generally described as having a healthy appearance, plump and showing little or no signs of decomposition. In some cases, when suspected graves were opened, villagers even described the corpse as having fresh blood from a victim all over its face. Evidence that a vampire was active in a given area included the death of cattle, sheep, relatives, or neighbors. Folkloric vampires could also make their presence felt by engaging in minor poltergeist-styled activity, such as hurling stones on roofs or moving household objects and pressing on people in their sleep. To ward off these evil beings, garlic was often used. A branch of wild rose and hawthorn are said to harm vampires, and sprinkling mustard seeds on the roof of a house was said to keep them away. Other sacred items include a crucifix, rosary, or holy water. Vampires are said to be unable to walk on consecrated ground, such as that of churches or temples, or cross running water. Mirrors have often been used to ward off vampires when placed facing outwards on a door. In some cultures, vampires do not have a reflection, and sometimes do not cast a shadow, perhaps as a manifestation of the vampire's lack of a soul. Some traditions hold that a vampire cannot enter a house unless invited by the owner. After the first invitation, they can come and go as they please. Although folkloric vampires were believed to be active at night, they were not generally considered vulnerable to sunlight. To destroy a vampire, staking was the most commonly cited method, particularly in Slavic culture. Ash was the preferred wood in Russia and the Baltic states, or hawthorn in Serbia, with a record of oak in Silesia. Aspen was also used for stakes, as it was believed that Christ's cross was made from aspen. Aspen branches on the graves of purported vampires were also believed to prevent their risings at night. Vampires were most often staked through the heart, although the mouth was targeted in Russia and northern Germany, and the stomach in northeast Serbia. Decapitation was another preferred method in German and Western Slavic areas, with the head buried between the feet, away from the body. This act was seen as a way of hastening the departure of the soul, which in some cultures was said to linger in the corpse. The vampire's head, body, or clothes could also be spiked and pinned to the earth to prevent rising. Tales of supernatural beings consuming the blood of the living have been found in nearly every culture around the world for many centuries. Blood drinking was attributed to demons or spirits who would eat flesh and drink blood. Even the devil was considered synonymous with the vampire. In early 1970, local press spread rumours that a vampire haunted Highgate Cemetery in London. Amateur vampire hunters flocked in large numbers to the cemetery. Several books have been written about the case, notably by Sean Manchester, a local man who was among the first to suggest the existence of the Highgate vampire. and who later claimed to have exorcised and destroyed a whole nest of vampires in the area. In January 2005, rumours circulated that an attacker had bitten a number of people in Birmingham, England, fueling concerns about a vampire roaming the streets. Local police stated that no such crime had been reported, and the case appears to be an urban legend. In 2006, a physics professor at the University of Central Florida wrote a paper arguing that it is mathematically impossible for vampires to exist, based on geometric progression. According to the paper, if the first vampire had appeared on the 1st of January 1600, if it fed once a month, and if every victim turned into a vampire, then within 2.5 years the entire human population would have become vampires. In some areas of Europe, especially in small localities, beliefs are still rampant, and sightings or claims of vampire attacks occur frequently. In Romania, during February 2004, several relatives of Toma Petre feared that he had become a vampire. They dug up his corpse, tore out his heart, burned it, and mixed the ashes with water in order to drink it. In September 2017, mob violence in Malawi related to a vampire scare killed about 6 people accused of being vampires. Vampirism and the vampire lifestyle also represent a relevant part of modern day's occultist movements. The mythos of the vampire, his magical qualities, allure, and predatory archetype express a strong symbolism that can be used in ritual, energy, and magic, and can even be adopted as a spiritual system. The vampire has been part of the occult society in Europe for centuries, and has spread into the American subculture as well, being strongly influenced by and mixed with the neo-Gothic aesthetics. A coven has been used as a collective noun for vampires, possibly based on the Wiccan usage. An alternative collection is a house of vampires. It has been hypothesized that vampire legends were influenced by individuals being buried alive because of shortcomings in the medical knowledge of the time. In some cases in which people reported sounds emanating from a specific coffin, it was later dug up and fingernail marks were discovered on the inside from the victim trying to escape. In other cases, the person would hit their heads, noses, or faces, and it would appear that they had been feeding. A problem with this theory is the question of how people presumably buried alive managed to stay alive for any extended period without food, water, or fresh air. An alternate explanation for noise is the bubbling of escaping gases from natural decomposition of bodies. Folkloric vampirism has been associated with clusters of death from unidentifiable or mysterious illnesses, usually within the same family or the same small community. The epidemic illusion is obvious in the classical case, and even more so in the case of Mercy Brown and the vampire beliefs of New England, generally where a specific disease, tuberculosis, was associated with outbreaks of vampirism. As with the mnemonic form of bubonic plague, it was associated with breakdown of lung tissue, which would cause blood to appear at the lips. In 1985, biochemist David Dolphin proposed a link between the rare blood disorder porphyria and vampiric folklore. He suggested that the consumption of large amounts of blood may result in heme being transported somehow across the stomach wall and into the bloodstream. Thus vampires were merely sufferers of porphyria, seeking to replace blood and alleviate their symptoms. This theory has been rebuffed medically. Rabies has also been linked with vampire folklore. Dr. Juan Gomez Alonso, a neurologist at Zeral Hospital in Vigo, Spain, examined this possibility in a report. The susceptibility to garlic and light could be due to hypersensitivity, which is a symptom of rabies. The disease can also affect portions of the brain that could lead to disturbance of normal sleep patterns, thus becoming nocturnal, and hypersexuality. Legend once said a man was not rabid if he could look at his own reflection, an allusion to the legend that vampires have no reflection. Wolves and bats, which are often associated with vampires, can be carriers of rabies. The disease can also lead to a drive to bite others and to a bloody frothing at the mouth. The reinvention of the vampire myth in the modern era is not without political overtones. The aristocratic Count Dracula, alone in his castle, appearing only at night to feed on his peasantry, is symbolic of the Ancien regime. In his entry for vampires in the Dictionnaire Philosophique 1764, Voltaire notices how the mid-18th century coincided with the decline of the folkloric belief in the vampire, but now there were stockbrokers and men of business who sucked the blood of the people in broad daylight, but they were not dead, though they were corrupted. These true bloodsuckers lived not in cemeteries, but in very agreeable places. A number of murderers have performed seemingly vampiric rituals upon their victims. Serial killers Peter Curtin and Richard Trenton Chase were both called vampires in the tabloids after they were discovered drinking the blood of the people they murdered. Similarly, in 1932, an unsolved murder case in Stockholm, Sweden, was nicknamed the Vampire Murder because of the circumstances of the victim's death. The late 16th century Hungarian countess and mass murderess Elizabeth Bathory became particularly infamous in later centuries' works, which depicted her bathing in the victim's blood. Vampire lifestyle is a term for a contemporary subculture of people, largely within the goth subculture, who consume the blood of others as a pastime, drawing from the rich recent history of popular culture related to cult symbolism, horror films, the fiction of Anne Rice, and the styles of Victorian England. Active vampirism within the vampire subculture includes both blood-related vampirism, commonly referred to as sanguine vampirism, and psychic vampirism, or supposed feeding from pranic energy. In the novel, Dracula transforms into a bat several times, and vampire bats themselves are mentioned twice. The 1927 stage production of Dracula followed the novel in having Dracula turn into a bat, as did the film, where Bela Lugosi would transform into a bat. The bat transformation scene was used again by Lon Chaney Jr. in 1943's Son of Dracula. Vampire bats have only recently become an integral part of the traditional vampire lore. Bats were integrated into vampire folklore after they were discovered on the South American mainland in the 16th century. There are no vampire bats in Europe, but bats and owls have long been associated with supernatural omens, mainly because of their nocturnal habits. The vampire is now a fixture in popular fiction. The vampire's fangs and vulnerability to sunlight appeared over the course of the 19th century, with Varney the vampire and Count Dracula both bearing protruding teeth, and Murnau's Nosferatu in 1922 featuring daylight. The cloak appeared in stage productions of the 1920s, with a high collar introduced by playwright Hamilton Dean to help Dracula vanish on stage. Much is made of the price of eternal life, namely the incessant need for blood of former equals. In all its iterations, from the legends of medieval Europe through to the Hollywood films, the vampire has become an icon of pop culture, horror, and folklore. Thanks for watching today's video from Monsters and Myths. We hope you enjoyed it. If you're still in the mood for more vampires, we're about to present a version of F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu for your viewing pleasure. Take care of yourselves and take it easy.